It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this conversation sponsored by the Global Technopolitics Forum. The forum works at the intersection of technology and geopolitics, and it's a great pleasure to have this conversation, particularly featuring Jeremy Ghez, a former colleague and eminent scholar. Let me turn things over to the president of the forum, Pari Esfandiari, to take it from there. Pari.
Well, thank you very much, Greg, and welcome everyone. Everywhere in the world are facing serious challenges. On one hand, generative AI is moving rapidly into decision making, changing how institutions think, how they analyze information, and even how they frame strategy. On the other hand, our digital ecosystem is fragmenting geopolitically. Governments are asserting sovereignty, regulations are diverging, and interdependence is increasingly being used as a geopolitical tool. So the question for leaders today is no longer should we use AI? It's how do we integrate it without losing judgment, accountability, or our strategic compass. I'm delighted to explore this with you and with Jeremy, whose work spans intelligence, strategy, geopolitics, and global economic trends. So to guide us in this discussion, I have sketched out 5 broad questions. They are not strict, just threads we can pull on as the conversation unfolds. So I start with our first question. How can leaders integrate generative AI into decision making while preserving human judgment, intuition, and accountability? I tend to think of generative AI as a cognitive amplifier. It widens our field of vision, but it doesn't replace the human lens that gives decisions meaning. There's a real risk today of what I call automation drift, the slow outsourcing of judgment simply because AI feels efficient or fluent. But strategic clarity, intuition, institutional memory, all those tacit cultural human layers cannot be outsourced. They come from lived experiences. So the real leadership task is boundary setting. Where does AI genuinely make us better thinkers? And where most human reasoning remain firmly at the center? I think that's the design challenge for institutions. And with that, I would like to turn to you, Greg. With your background in intelligence assessment, you have seen how tools can expand our perspective, but also distort it. How should today's leaders balance AI-generated insight with the kind of human judgment that only experience provides?
It's a great question, and one I thought a lot about. I come to this from an intelligence point of view, and from that point of view, particularly for intelligence assessment, those people trying to make sense of the world out there, I think AI will be a great help, a great boon to them. It can handle so much more data than the human mind can, so it will be able to summarize reams of data for them, help them. I think that's going to be invaluable. It'll also not forget things, as we forgot those Arabs taking flying lessons in the summer before 9/11. So I think it'll have a great advantage. The key, I think, is continuing to think of it as a tool. It's a tool that needs to be used, but needs to be used carefully. In some ways, I think I tend to divide intelligence problems between puzzles and mysteries. The puzzles have an answer, we just don't know it. Mysteries don't have an answer. They're iffy, they may depend on our actions as well. I think that AI would be particularly helpful in dealing with puzzles, being able to sort out lots and lots of data. The mysteries are where the humans have to take responsibility, and that means having some guidelines, continually checking, doing lots of red teaming, I think, to try and make sure that we don't get hallucinations or other errors coming out of AI. Needs to be careful, I think, and to that sense, I want to continue to think of it as a tool, one we want to use, but one we want to be able to control. The challenge is having the algorithms be transparent enough so that analysts will understand them and trust them and be able to explain them to people who aren't very sophisticated in the technology. That, I think, is the leadership challenge I see in coming out of the intelligence world. But I'll be eager to hear Jeremy's thoughts about that question coming from a business background. Again, welcome, Jeremy.
Well, thank you both. Thank you for having me. And I think I agree with many of the points you made. Translated into a business background, what does this mean? The risk is that these leaders and these business leaders see these LLMs as Wikipedia on steroid or as a flawless secretary or copy editor. And it means that they basically delegate anything they write or anything they produce to those machines. It's fairly easy to see that if that happens, anything that we produce is going to become bland. It's going to become incredibly undifferentiated. And I am very much obsessed with those graphs that we've seen circulate in the press, of the amount produced by artificial intelligence versus the amount produced by humans. There's no differentiating aspect anymore. Everyone says the same thing. Everyone feeds the consensus. And I think one common point among many others between intelligence and business is that we all know what the consensus is, but that's rarely helpful. And it's rarely giving us, some clear solutions. So I would say, Greg is absolutely correct. And what you say also applies to business. AI is probably going to be here to generate new hypotheses, to shed light on avenues we may not necessarily explore, and, try to basically help us understand, is there a case against conventional wisdom? Is there a case against those explanations that everyone loves because it fits our understanding of the world, but that might deserve some challenge? That can help with puzzles. I think it can help with mysteries too, at least as a tool, exactly what Gregory said. But in terms of building alternative hypotheses, I've thought of 4 things that ultimately needs to happen for this to be effective, at least in the world of business. Number 1, these leaders are going to have to show patience and time. In my experience, it's never the case that the first outputs of those LLMs are the good one. So patience and time, challenge the machine, and don't consider it as the flawless answer that you would get. Number 2, and this too obsesses me as a pedagogue, I've seen several studies suggest you better speak English very well, or you better speak French very well. The poverty of your language is going to translate into very poor outputs coming from LLMs. So being a good English speaker, a good French speaker, a good any speaker is going to help you really nail down the subtlety of what you need. Number 3, the hallucinations widely documented. We know about this. I am also stunned by the fact that researchers have been using these as an image of the world that could have been. Meaning, why is this a hallucination? Is that another way of generating new hypotheses about how the world works and doesn't work? And last but not least, going back to what Greg said initially, really always be in the driver's seat. And having that ability to basically be the person ultimately treating this. The way I do this very concretely, to give you an example, is, I try to get LLMs to talk to each other. So if I ask a question to ChatGPT, I may go down to Claude or Grok or Gemini to basically, ask to build on it and then go back. That copy and pasting, I think, is a good way for an individual, a human, to stay in the pilot seat and not let LLMs decide what you want to do.
My first experience with LLMs was with soon after ChatGPT came out. When I was speaking at a conference in Washington on AI and the future of intelligence. My colleague, more technologically savvy than I was already into ChatGPT, so he asked Chat to do a 2,500-word essay on what Greg Treverton would think about AI and the future of intelligence. But it was a striking experience. It got me hooked on Chat or other LLMs, but it also showed the limitations, because it was good. There weren't hallucinations, though we have to always be on the lookout for those. But there were no hallucinations. It was a little banal, but most important, obviously, it could know only things that I had written, that it had been able to see, right? So the things I'd been talking about or thinking about, but not writing, was a limitation. I think we need to keep that limitation in mind as we think about leadership and AI.
I have been working with AI, and on a monthly basis, I see how it's becoming perfecting itself. So in many ways, it's advancing. We don't know what's going to happen in next phase and how it's going to improve. But at the end, I think the judgment sits at the shoulders of the leaders. And with that, I think we can think about the governance structures and red lines we need to ensure AI strengthens deliberation rather than replacing it. So personally, I suspect we will soon see organizations treat AI governance the way they treat ethical or financial oversights, with clear committees, guardrails, and mandatory transparency. So if AI is influencing strategic thinking, boards also need visibility. Who used AI, for what purposes, and how was it validated? So some decisions must remain human, not because AI is dangerous, but because legitimacy, empathy, and accountability don't come from algorithm. In governance, red lines are as important as green lights, and both will have to evolve as we learn. So I do like to hear your point of view, Greg, that how do you see these limitations and guardrails, basically?
I think first I just want to echo what Jeremy said, and that is the better you ask the questions, the better the output you get. So it really is very important to be very careful about the questions you ask Chat or Gemini or any of the other LLMs. So I think that's the starting point, being careful about the questions you ask, and then continually checking, continually doing some red teaming, some checking of the things you can check. We know it's going to make mistakes. We know the LLMs are going to make mistakes. So being on the lookout for those. How you then go beyond that to build in some accountability. Certainly, we want to make it transparent when LLMs are being used, when AI is being used. The more transparent we can be about that, I think, the better. So we have to know that this is a great problem for teachers, I think, and Jeremy can speak to that as well. That with AI out there, where AI ends and a student's work begins is hard. But that, I think, is something that runs through all uses of AI and does require lots of leadership, as much transparency as possible, a lot of accountability, and as I said, quite a lot of red teaming or similar things to ask kind of what if, what's the opposite, why might this be wrong? I think those are the starting point. We're still a long way, it seems to me, from more established structures for thinking about how we put some guardrails or some safety nets around AI. But that's the beginning point, I think.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right, and I agree with both of you. You know, I often think of what people have said about car accidents. When they involve humans, they're a tragedy, and when they involve computers, they're an absolute scandal. Our ability to accept the dangers related to computers and to what may happen because we misuse them or because they make mistakes is close to nil as a society. It would be very, very hard to accept. So I think the accountability part is critical. That you have to have someone in the driver's seat who will basically be able to be held to account on the decisions he or she made in the past. And that to me is the red line not to cross, making AI anything else than an analyst, and making humans anything else than the reviewers of that analysis and the decision makers. The red team part, and you know, I mean, Greg is a former colleague and most certainly a mentor, so I will certainly not disagree with him here. You know, when it comes to business and when it comes to leaders in business in terms of accountability, you know, this tribal world really requires them and requires us to help them think against themselves, you know, and basically try to build a case against the most straightforward statements that they would go to the bank on. and to get them to understand that they will never be experts in anything if they cannot argue both sides of an argument. That's the best way to not be held hostage by the algorithm of AI. That's the best way to expand horizons. And I think in terms of accountability, that's as well the best way to basically understand, well, the pros and the cons and the limits and the flaws of your own reasoning ultimately. I'm always reminded at this point of the conversation of the late, Henry Kissinger, who would always tell us, mutually assured destruction in the middle of the Cold War was incredibly scary. But we did have one consolation, is that at the end of the day, we knew that whoever would be pressing the button on the other side was a human. And he said right before he passed away, what guards us against the fact that now these decisions may be assisted or even taken by artificial intelligence, and artificial intelligence may just decide, let's get rid of these very messy humans and talk between ourselves, among ourselves. That is, to me, the ultimate reminder of the fact that, leadership comes with accountability. And if we don't do this, we are going to end up in trouble.
Yeah, I can't agree more. Accountability, I think, is still human and must remain human. One concern I have is under competitive pressure. Businesses may outrun governance, and I think we see signs of that. How do you see that? You're working a lot with businesses. How do you see that shaping?
No, I think that that's a true risk. What you have to be careful about is basically how this power is concentrated in the hands of a few. All right, so the economist answer would be to say, look, today in December 2025, we know that OpenAI is in a bad position as of today. We know that Sam Altman, per the press, basically declared code red, seeing, Gemini, Google's model, outperform it in ways no one expected a year ago. So as an economist, I would tell you creative destruction is at work, competition works, and that basically these guys are keeping each other honest. Now, as a citizen, as a political scientist, and as a student of geopolitics, I want to be very careful with that too, because I don't know if I feel comfortable going to the bank on the idea that pure market competition will solve it all. And I also want to say, there may actually even be a model problem. By that, I mean, we know that the Chinese LLMs are mostly open source, and this might actually be a even more critical structural decision that no one in the United States or no one in the Western world is actually making. In the end, this may be a critical fault. That means that all of those LLMs become far more obsolete and far more quickly obsolete than we ever imagined. And that's going to create some tensions for Western technology and its ability to maintain edges. So I think there has to be a new form of conversation happening between governments and these tech companies. Businesses, they do see, the pressure of markets, thankfully, but I also think there has to be some form of dialogue about how do we allow for competition and more economic competition at the very moment geopolitical tensions are making this somewhat of a less agreeable prospect for many policymakers.
Which brings me to fragmentation of digital ecosystem. So right now we are seeing very different AI output in different parts of the world, and the fragmentation is increasing. So Greg, how would you see this situation that different blocks or different parts of the world are going to see world differently? So are we heading to this complete differences of worldview in different parts of the world? And how would that impact both businesses and leaders if they are increasingly thinking differently and seeing the world, have a different worldview?
We certainly see geopolitics raising its ugly head in all sorts of ways as we think about AI. I mean, even the difference between the United States and Europe, where the United States has mostly emphasized the competitive aspect, said, let her rip, let's go as fast as we can. The Europeans have tried to structure AI research some, have found it difficult, and in the process worry that they're losing out on the competition, that their firms are not able to keep up. So I think we will see this geopolitical competition. Whether we can put some international guardrails around it, I think that's the question very much out there, and one that does, as Jeremy suggests, require quite different conversation between governments and the tech sector. The US has been reluctant to do much governmental work, has mostly let it rip, let the technologists run with it. And that's produced fantastic results, but it seems to me, it can't be the end of the conversation. There's got to begin to be a conversation between governments and the private sector about next steps, about how we try and build in some guardrails at least, or some accountability. I think those are conversations that are going to be difficult to structure given the geopolitical aspect of this, but I think they're critical conversations to have. I mean, in some sense, it seems to me the United States ought to be working with China on AI. We both share an interest in not having the worst outcomes and not having those outcomes that Jeremy characterized Henry Kissinger as talking about. So we share that interest. And in a certain sense, we've also gone in somewhat different directions. We might actually learn something from each other. The Chinese, in their fashion, have tended to centralize their government role in AI, while we've maintained a very decentralized approach. So, both for reasons of global security and safety, and maybe even learning something, it seems to me this is an area where the United States ought to be talking more with China, and obviously Europe is a critical piece of the puzzle as well. So having those conversations seems to me to be very important and still out there on the horizon.
Yeah, no, it's hard to disagree. Looking at this from the standpoint of Europeans today, especially in the wake of the new national security strategy published last week, it's hard not to see somewhat of a onslaught from, the US on Europe that kind of feels unprecedented. I think many Europeans, Germany being a case in point here, always thought that you'd lived in a globalized world. One German political scientist, Constanze Stelzenmüller, once said, Germany thought so much about this global world that it outsourced its defense strategy to Washington and to NATO, its energy policy to Moscow, and its export-driven economic strategy to China. Well, it paid all three prices quite dearly. So, and what's striking too, so this is coming from policymakers in this current Trump administration. It's also coming from key sectors like Jamie Dimon and the banking sector that suggest, there's a consensus that Europe is in big trouble, and that, to a large extent, don't look at it through any other lens than that one specifically. What Europeans, I think, do correctly is to basically use extraterritorial law to try to bend, those commercial and market-driven interests. Maybe they do it too much. Maybe they do it in excess. And maybe, like any regulator, they're trying to regulate something that is a moving target and that keeps on changing. And that can be incredibly, incredibly hard. But that fragmentation, ironically enough, might actually have met its own ally in technology. I always thought of technology as the ultimate guardrail forbidding fragmentation to happen. At the end of the day, we all rely on technology, and we all rely on the same technology. Well, I'm increasingly testing or challenging that hypothesis that this fragmentation means technology is going to get fragmented. We're not going to use the same things. The Huawei precedent with 5G certainly shows that we're willing to give up cost-friendly and effective solutions in the name of security interests. And this may very well be the future of AI too, so if we're not careful. I think there's never been a more meaningful time to think about track two diplomacy here. There is a potential for breakdown of conversations among policymakers, but the ability of business to business conversations, of academics to academics, of think tankers to think tankers, well, that has never been more important to keep that conversation going in terms of sharing notes and sharing perspectives, I think.
You both emphasize the importance of having a conversation between businesses and governments. And I agree. But I think there is also a role for the civil society. We have to think that because at the end, it's the users, it's the end users who will have the impact. They have to live with the impact of these decisions. And I wonder what kind of role we can think about that would civil society and think tanks could play in this, in bridging the gap and also ensuring that the AI is developed in a way that serves the public benefit rather than benefiting governments and businesses.
It's going to be a real challenge trying to bring civil society into this because things are progressing at such different paces in different places, right? That so far it's going fast in the United States and fast in China and a few other places, but much of the world has so far been left out, has been pure consumers of what's happening elsewhere. So that I think does reinforce the challenge to which we've dedicated the forum, and that is trying to include civil society in the conversation as an important piece. But that is going to be hard for the near future, given the pace of technological change, given the pace of advance in AI, and the fact that it's mostly occurring in a handful of places, not widely spread around the world. So that challenge, I think, is very much before us as well. And it will challenge, I think, both international forums like the United Nations and other places, but trying to do that without pushing along the fragmentation of cyberspace. That's, again, a key part of the challenge we face.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I think that, think tanks, civil society, uh, pedagogy, and the education system in general may also help, with the changing mindset. I'm quite struck by conversations increasingly turn to more systemic analysis and how we think more in systems rather than through straight causality or straightforward causality. I'm a PhD of the late 2000s. When I remember the period, I obviously remember 2008. It was a defining crisis. It was a life-changing crisis in many ways. And it really changed, perspectives on a wide range of things. The fact of the matter is, 2008, looking back at it, as ironic as it may seem, was a pretty straightforward crisis. It was one that we looked at and that we can look through 20th century financial crises of a system that really did not work properly because it didn't have enough guardrails. Fast forward to today, what we're going through is an economic transformation, but it's not just that. It's a geopolitical transformation, but it's not just that. It's a societal transformation, but it's not just that. It's most certainly a political transformation, but it's not just that. It's a climate transformation, but it's not just that. And let me finish with it's a technological challenge, but it's not just that. It's all of those things at the same time. That means the way we think about society, the way we think about our vulnerabilities, the way we think about our own resilience is going to change. And I think, inviting AI into the conversation means really changing the way we think about political debates, the way we think about policy debates. And it might actually create new strains in the way we even help younger to less young students think fundamentally. Thinking in systems is really a very different way than thinking linearly. And I think that's going to be a real challenge where we're going to have to engage with people and help educate them and help educate themselves on topics in ways that we never really talked about. And what I just said about AI, I would tell you would be the same probably about climate change to a large extent.
The problem is even more than that because they interact and they interact so rapidly and intensify one another. So what we are seeing, it's just intensifying and becoming more. So the risk is huge. And even I wonder what human gonna mean being a human in, let's say, next decade. The meaning of human agency is changing. How we are gonna find tools that helps us to deal with the unknown.
I think that's exactly correct. And maybe we lack modesty, thinking we as humans, Homo sapiens, to be precise, are the ultimate step of evolution. Maybe we're not. Maybe there's something fundamentally that will transform how we define humans. I mean, Yuval Noah Harari, I like to describe him as the person who wrote the book we all pretended to read in Sapiens. I mean, makes an incredibly convincing and terrifying point at the same time. Sapiens made it to the top. We knew that because of their ability to coordinate. Harari brings this conversation one step forward and saying, back to 2008, we were able to save the system because we put in parentheses the G7, we brought together the G20 at the table in London in April 2009, just a few months after Lehman Brothers fell. We demonstrated our ability to coordinate. 3 years of violence, be it in Eastern Europe or with the October 7th attack and the terrifying war that happened afterwards, this is just a reminder that we should go to the bank on our ability to coordinate, to cooperate with one another, and especially in times where we feel everything's moving at the same time and our ability to be snowballed into a radically different planet that we don't recognize is making us insecure economically, politically, but culturally as well. And that too might be a fundamental problem that AI is accelerating in ways that empowers us, but in ways that destabilize us as well.
We need to balance openness in this geopolitical environment, keep the sovereignty and the accountability. So we need to have the three components together and we cannot focus in one.
In principle, this is a world where there ought to be much more sharing of information, it seems to me, in the common interest. But that's not the way geopolitics are going. Jeremy earlier emphasized the national security strategy and its swipes at Europe. So we've entered a somewhat different world, one that seems more like the 19th century in some respects than the 21st century. We don't know exactly what shape that's going to take and how long it's going to last, and will it be permanent? But now we seem to be in a period of increased interest in sovereignty and somewhat less interest in sharing that huge amount of information that's out there. We can think of all sorts of ways to do it, and AI can empower that sharing. But so far, it doesn't look like we're going quite in that direction because geopolitics has dominated the conversation so far. And I think trying to get beyond that, those geopolitical hurdles is going to be a very difficult task. We can lay it all on the foot of at the feet of the Trump administration, but it's wider than that. And those challenges, I think, come on top of the fundamental challenges we talked about, and that is keeping human control and human accountability, even as the technology marches along.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, in this changing world that Greg described very well, if it's going to be increasingly transactional, increasingly this for that and whatever else, that means the long-term architecture is going to be far harder to define and far more moving. So those conversations are going to be critical. I am a pessimist over the ability of policymakers to have that conversation in the long run, so long as there are deep domestic political pressures that continue. This is where track two actually is going to matter. It may not necessarily come from governments and policymakers, and I realize the irony of arguing this in front of Greg, but it may come from increasingly more from private actors who, ironically enough, may be as legitimate so long as they haven't suffered, I guess, from those pressures, or that they aren't, considered so long as they're considered as competent enough. And that, I think, is going to be the clear signal going down the line.
We know how important the tech tycoons are, but incorporating them in the conversation, I think Jeremy's exactly right, that is a place for kind of track two. Ideally, it would be in some ways led or at least spearheaded by the private sector leaders themselves. So far, we don't really see that happening, but I think that's got to be part of the future as we think about a very changed geopolitical circumstance.
And as we are getting close to end of our conversation, I want to emphasize that while governments are important, of course, they have the key role and the private sector is important, but I don't think we can leave it just in the hand of market. And I think comes to another segment to this, and that's the civil society. So I think we need multi-stakeholder or multi-sectoral dialogue in order to provides kind of governance that we envision for the future. And in that, I think we went full circle from judgment to governance to accountability to geopolitical divergence and finally the democratic question. And with that, I want to thank you, both of you, for being here. It was great talking to you. Thank you.